Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, and welcome to our seminar on tracking export restrictions and other trade sanctions. My name is Joe Glauber. I'm the interim secretary for AMIS, the Agricultural Market Information System. I'm also a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and before that, chief economist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I think, as most of you know, AMIS was created in 2011 on the heels of the food price spikes in 2007-8 and 2010-11. One of its major roles was to provide better information on markets to help prevent adverse policy actions like export restrictions that we know were exacerbating market prices at that time. Export restrictions were used extensively in 2007-8, where some 35 countries or so imposed restrictions on a variety of commodities, covering almost 20% of calories traded. Export restrictions, again, were featured in 2010-11 and more recently in 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the Russian invasion began in late February, we've again seen countries turn to export restrictions. Our panel today is composed of representatives from some of the international organizations and institutions that are tracking these restrictions. Annelies Deuss from OECD and Majda Petschen from WTO will describe their organization's efforts to track export restrictions. Annelies and Majda help pull together the policy monitoring for AMIS. They will be followed by Miriam Morath from the International Grains Council. Like WTO and OECD, IGC is also a member of the AMIS Secretariat. And Miriam will be followed by my colleague, David Laborde, who's a senior research fellow at IFPRI. David will describe the export tracking system he's put together at IFPRI and has been using. And last but certainly not least will be Chad Bown, who's the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute International Economics. Chad's been working on putting together a tracker on sanctions, dealing with the Ukraine crisis. And of course, is well known in trade policy circles, and in particular for, if nothing else, tracking the U.S.-China Phase 1 deal. I wish this program were longer. We'd like to have included others who are doing some of the work. UNCTAD, for example, also a member of AMIS, is also tracking export restrictions, but they were unable to be here today. And of course, Simon Ebenet's great work at Global Trade Alert. Again, if we'd had more time, we could have tried to broaden this into a longer program, and maybe we'll consider doing that later. But let's get on with the program. We're going to take Q&As in the chat. Sorry, this can't be more interactive, but we'll try to get this. And before I forget, because I know we're going to get away from time, I'm going to thank the AMIS Secretariat, who's been so helpful pulling this together, Dennis Drexler, Simon Bordenave, and Alexis Pouillon. Okay, with that, Majda, Annelies, you're going to start.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm going to share my presentation. Okay, so I hope everybody can see this. Okay, so hello everyone. So first of all, I would like to thank Joe Glauber, our AMIS secretary at Interim, for organizing the first thematic AMIS webinar on a very timely topic, namely export restrictions and sanctions. So my name is Annelies Deuss. I work at the OECD, and together with my colleague Majda Petschen from the WTO, we will give you an overview of how we monitor and report export restrictions for AMIS. I will start the presentation and then I will hand over to Majda. So there are two main outlets of policy dissemination in AMIS, namely the AMIS Policy Database and the Policy Development section in the AMIS Market Monitor. Now, before we describe each of these two outlets in more detail, I'll first explain how these two outputs compare to one another. So let's start with the purpose. So the policy database has more of an analytical purpose, namely it allows us to analyze the impact of policies, to track the evolution of a specific policy over time, and to compare policies between countries and commodities. The purpose of the policy development section really is to provide updates of recent policy developments. The format then of the policy database is, as the word already says, it's a quantitative database, whereas in the Market Monitor, we present the information in descriptive paragraphs, so the information is purely qualitative. Accessing the policy database can be done through an online tool, and we are in the process of finalizing a new online tool that allows users to query and download the database, and I will tell you a little bit more about this later on. The policy section takes up about 1 or 2 pages in the Market Monitor, and you can access the whole publication on the AMIS homepage. Then which are the type of policies that are included in the AMIS policy database? Well, we focus on a subset of policies, namely export restrictions, import tariffs, tariff quotas, and producer and consumer support estimates. In the Market Monitor, we cover all trade and domestic policies that can influence prices, trade, production, or consumption. We use certain rules for inclusion. So in the policy database, we only report on those policies that have been implemented. Whereas in the Market Monitor, we include all policies that have been announced, are intended to be implemented, as well as have already been implemented. And so the idea here really is that the mere announcement of a new policy or a change in a policy can already influence markets, and we should, of course, report this. Then the frequency of updating, so for the AMIS policy database, it's annual, and the Market Monitor is published 10 times a year, so the updating is almost monthly. Finally, who collects the information? So for the policy database, for the dataset on export restrictions, this is a unique dataset that is developed and updated by the OECD for AMIS. Information on import tariffs and tariff quotas comes directly from the WTO members' notifications, and information on producer and consumer support estimates comes from the OECD PSE-CSE database. The policy section then is prepared by the WTO and OECD with inputs from our colleagues in FAO, IGC, and the other international organizations. And I'll tell you a bit more about this process later. So now let's have a look at the AMIS policy database. So the AMIS policy database can be accessed online. And in fact, at the OECD, we have developed a new online tool thanks to a financial contribution from Canada. And we're planning to launch the new online tool in the coming months. There are 2 main parts in this tool, namely the query and download page. This is where you can query the database and bulk download the entire database. And then the other part is the part called Policies at a Glance. And so on this page, you get a set of interactive figures, which give a snapshot of the contents and the potential of the AMIS policy database. Now, before we have a look at these figures, I'll give you a quick overview of which information you can find in the AMIS policy database. So I already told you that we collect information on several policies. And so for the remainder of my presentation, I'll focus entirely on export restrictions, since this is the topic of today's webinar. So what do we cover? Well, we cover the AMIS countries, the AMIS commodities, which are wheat, maize, rice, and soybeans. We include several export restrictions, such as bans, quotas, taxes, minimum export prices, licensing. And we have collected this information on such policies that have been implemented from the 1st of January 2007 onwards. We have multiple fields in the database, and I just listed a few of them. So we keep track of the HS code, the HS version, the description, when was the policy started, when was it ended, when was the policy published. We also record the hyperlink, and we also save the hyperlink as a PDF because, of course, after some time, certain links no longer work. And so we are sure that we still have this link and we can access this information. We also record the source, the value, the index, and the units. And if there are any conditions or exemptions, we also record all this information in the database. So we have 1 line per HS code and per policy. And so at the OECD, we collect this information and we update this information, and we use official legal documents, government websites, and other reliable outlets to find this information. And just to give you an idea of how we do this, I'll give you an example of an export tax on soybeans in Argentina. So this is then the information that we found on an official government website with legal documents. So we would save this link in the AMIS policy database. So we would take the name of the decree, the publication date, scroll down, and then we find the HS codes, we find the value of the export tax, and then we would enter all this information into the AMIS policy database. So here are some of the fields. So we have the policy measure, which is an export tax, the commodity group soybeans. We look at the HS code, the HS version, the commodity description, the unit, the value, the start date, end date. We have the link in there, the date of publication, the title of notice, and so forth. Turning then to the online tool and the interactive figures that we have. So here are some screenshots of the interactive figures that will be available on the online tool. We're still finalizing this online tool, so this is why I can only show you screenshots today. But just imagine that there are sliders to select the time periods and then also drop-down menus to select the commodity or the policy or the country. So here is in this slide the first set of interactive figures related to export restrictions. So here we show the evolution of the 5 main types of export restrictions over time. And you see that we start on the 1st of January 2007. And so there are 2 different ways to explore the data. So you can either select the time period and the commodity, or you can select the time periods and the policy. The second set of figures shows the composition by commodity or by policy. So that is in the figure on the top, you can select a time period, and then you can see which of the AMIS commodities were most targeted by all of the 5 main export restrictive policies combined during that period. And then in the figure below, we show this for all AMIS commodities combined, but we give the breakdown by the different policies. So we show which policy was used most frequently in a certain period on all of the AMIS commodities combined. And then this final set of figures shows the duration of these export restrictions. And again, the user can select the time period and the policy and then examine how long the policy lasted in number of days. And so we differentiate between 6 categories for the duration. So from 1 to 30 days, from 31 to 180 days, and so forth. Okay, so then the next is the Market Monitor and the policy development section in the AMIS Market Monitor. So here is a screenshot of the most recent edition, the April edition of this year, where we had 2.5 pages for the policy section. Usually we have 1 page or 1.5 pages. Now, how do we put the section together? Well, it's really a nice example of how the different international organizations work together on this. So usually OECD and WTO take the lead in providing a first draft, and we gather information mostly from different news outlets, but also from government websites, legislative documents. Then a first draft is sent to our colleagues in FAO and IGC, and they provide feedback. And then we do some additional cross-checking, and often there will be several email exchanges between a list of people at OECD, WTO, IGC, and FAO, and then we verify and with the websites, and also we verify with our AMIS focal points. And then a version is prepared that goes into the draft of the monthly monitor, which is then sent to all the different IOs for feedback. And then we incorporate any remaining comments in the draft, and then the monitor is published. Okay, so that's it for me for now. I'll now give the floor to my colleague Majda Petschen from the WTO.
Thank you very much, Annelies. Hello, everybody. I think I would like to address upfront one very recurring question that I get very often from delegations and colleagues here, even in Geneva. And it is, how useful is WTO's own notification system as a source to track export restrictions on a timely basis? And I guess here the key word is on a timely basis. Well, basically, members have the choice to notify their measures on 2 different outlets. They must notify the Committee on Agriculture of any quantitative export restriction when it is introduced temporarily to relieve critical shortages of foodstuffs. And for developing countries, it's important to know that if they are not net exporters of the foodstuff concerned, that requirement is entirely waived under our special and differential treatment provisions. And in any case, since 24th of February, we have not received any notification addressed to the Committee on Agriculture. Now, members may also opt to notify any quantitative restriction as part of the general transparency procedures set out by the Committee on Market Access. And this second set of reporting procedures covers both import and export restrictions as far as they are quantitative. It also covers both agricultural and non-agricultural products. For example, a few members have already notified export restrictions on agricultural products or on fertilizers, or even import and export restrictions implemented as part of their economic sanctions. Now, under the second reporting requirement, quantitative restrictions do not necessarily need to be of a temporary nature, and the rationale for imposing them may not be limited to the sole purpose of alleviating critical shortages of foodstuffs. For example, members may invoke the necessity to protect human, animal, and plant health, and the measure could be placed permanently if all relevant criteria and conditions are met under GATT Article 20. Now, this being said, the WTO remains a valuable venue for members to raise trade-related concerns and exchange information. And I think the next slides illustrates this point. In the absence of timely submissions, it is not uncommon for our membership to draw on external sources of information. Annelies has just described how we collect information on the export restrictions side. And this slide showcases a little bit the value of the AMIS policy database as a reliable source of information. It was actually used by 5 members to generate descriptive statistics on export restrictions and prohibitions imposed on the 4 AMIS crops. So here, in a way, we're taking a leap forward from the tracking phase onto the analysis phase. Here, a comparative analysis of export restrictions was presented over 2 distinct 5-year periods in terms of number of measures imposed, number of notifications received by the WTO, number of measures by broad export restriction category, and here you can see the relative prevalence of export quotas during the first period, 2007-2012. We have also some inputs and some exchange information regarding the concentration of export restrictions by AMIS product category, and also the average duration of the measures, which in most cases was found to exceed 1,000 days. I think the important point here is that the AMIS policy database and the tracking system contributed to engage the WTO members in fruitful discussions on this topic. And the document reference in this slide is publicly available if you wish to dive into the details of these statistics. Of course, this in no way excuses the deficit on the notification side. Now, to conclude our intervention, our last slide briefly comes back to the nature of policies we usually track in the market monitor. So beyond the mere number of measures that we have tracked monthly, we should perhaps underscore the fact that some of the measures that we have reported this month, although classified as export restrictions and accounted for as such, are of a trade facilitating nature. And one perfect example is perhaps the decision by a major exporting country to significantly increase its wheat export quota for the 22-23 season from 2 million to 10 million tons. So a lot of attention seems to be paid to the number of decrees and regulations relating to export restrictions. And sometimes it's a little bit unclear to us whether the trade facilitating nature of some of these regulations is accounted for by the various trackers or in subsequent analyses and even simulations. So this could be perhaps food for thought in our discussion today. Our March compilation also makes room for a range of other trade facilitating measures introduced to cope with tight supplies, and these typically include the elimination of or the lowering of import duties on several agricultural products, including ethanol, allowing the national banking sector to apply more flexible financing requirements to facilitate imports of essential commodities, for example, rice, relaxing the application of certain SPS and TBT standards on emergency grain and feed imports, and also authorizing the importation of genetically modified crops for use in animal feeds. And of course, the last category of measures that we are very keen to continue reporting on are government measures of assistance. We believe that those domestic support measures that are taken to mitigate market disturbances and extreme price volatility, and in the end build resilience on both the production and consumption sides should be tracked as well. So alongside our traditional compilation of strictly trade-related policies, we will continue monitoring these domestic support measures, and these typically include the constitution of special food security reserves, increased market price support to encourage grain production, government income support packages, and direct payments to compensate for rising input costs. So this is simply an overview. This concludes our presentation, and we'll be happy to take up any questions later on. Over to you, Joe.
Great, thanks so much, both of you. This is excellent. I'll turn right to Miriam, and Miriam, if you can go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. The ITC is honored to be here. I sent my presentation over to be shared. I'm not sure whether I could bring this up on the screen, because there were some technical issues earlier on. Thank you.
So Alexis, are you going to load that? Perfect.
Is that good? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, that's it. Yeah, if you could just move on to the next slide, please. And yes, and one more, please. Thank you very much. Yes, since the escalation of the conflict in the Black Sea region at the end of February 2022, a number of trade-related measures have been introduced, as you're probably all very well aware of. And usually, those trade-related measures are designed to achieve or sustain food security or mitigate temporary supply issues, and concern are not usually in place forever. But yeah, to monitor this, the ITC Secretariat has set up a dedicated database reporting trade measures and other policy development. This is in addition to our usual reporting and can also be identified in all our other daily publications. If you could just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So it's called #BlackSeaRegion Database. It is updated on a daily basis, assuming there are any developments which are to be reported on. There are also days where it's not, where no news are reported in that respect. It contains plans and intentions of measures concerning all grains, rice, and oilseeds and pulses. These are the commodities we cover within the Council's remit. We also try to look at fertilizer, as this has become a major issue in the current marketing year and going into the new marketing year as well. But this is not part of our expertise, but whenever we come something across, we would also include it in the database. As I briefly mentioned before, it covers much more than trade measures, and it's also looking at policy developments and other policies related in response to the conflict in the Black Sea region. Also, the database is called FLEX-D Region Database. It really covers countries worldwide because we found a number of countries across the world have introduced measures in response to the conflict. It has a search function by country and by date. Maybe the only drawback is that it doesn't cover any analysis of the measures. It is pure reporting and provision of the information, and this is just how it looks on our website. And then if you could just move on to the next slide, please. This is very rudimentary and not very pretty. I apologize for that, but it just shows you since the 24th of February how many trade measures have been introduced. Each point reflects at least one policy that has been announced on that date. As you can see, some of the red dots, they show policies that have been adjusted over time. And if you just move on to the next slide, thank you. These are just some samples of the policies which have been covered. As for example, Egypt, which has increased its moisture tolerance limit to allow imports from wider origin, which, as Majda alluded to earlier, also leads to probably more trade rather than less trade. And we're looking at Ukraine, where a number of measures have been introduced. Initially, all exports have been banned of barley, oats, rye, millet, and buckwheat. Then export licenses for wheat and maize and sunflower seed oil have been introduced. For maize and sunflower seed oil, they have been removed again as sufficient stocks are thought to be in place to cover both the international and domestic demand. Export licenses are still in place for wheat. Also, there's increasing talk that this might be changed in the near-term future. Obviously, this comes with the caveat that exports from seaports are still halted for at the moment indefinitely for the duration of the conflict. And at the moment, it's a bit unclear what efforts, how sustainable efforts are to look for alternative shipping routes, including rail and truck. And then a number of smaller countries, such as Lebanon, have export of locally produced foods. But this is not necessarily something which is that relevant for the global trade overall. And now just moving on, because earlier I said that the daily reporting doesn't cover any analysis. In our monthly grain market report, which is usually published, I think that was on the 17th. The next one will be on the 21st of April. This covers all confirmed policies, not just the unconfirmed measures or intentions of introducing something. And all confirmed measures will then obviously also form part of our supply and demand analysis. And I think in the interest of time, I will leave it here. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Miriam. That was very helpful. Okay, David, if you can, as soon as they relinquish the screen, you can load your presentation. There you go.
Yep. Well, I'm going to follow up on the presentation, and thanks a lot for this opportunity. So I'm going to show what we are doing currently at IFPRI, and actually something that we have started during the COVID-19 episode, where we have seen this type of measure implemented, and because it's a topic that we have worked on both in particularly in 2011, coming from the previous food crisis, but also the ongoing one at the time. And it's a work we are currently doing with Abdullah Mahmoud, my colleague, that is in the audience. So there was a previous version of this tracker we did 2 years ago, and it was actually widely used both by other international organizations, by academic, including, I would say, people that are not in the trade or even agricultural topic, also because during the COVID-19, we've seen a number of export restrictions on medical equipment and things like this. So people were interested to make the link with what's happened in the agricultural sectors. And we also had basically a cross-fertilization with the media, because the media bring news, but also the media want to have a big picture. And so it was a very interesting process, and we did communication. And of course, there is an analytical dimension, but really the tool is designed to bring information robust enough to be used. So there is a lot of verification, but also in a very timely manner in order that we kind of influence what's going on more than, you know, analyzing the situation after the battle. So broadly speaking, the key input in this system is analysis of news and also notification about information that is, first of all, coming online. And we use different API to browse the internet, initially in 4 languages, then in 12. Now we're expanding to 22 languages because also a lot of legislation are basically in native language, so you don't find them in English. We also rely, of course, on a number of automatic translation because the team doesn't speak 22 languages. But any piece of information we collect is reviewed by a human because there is a need of interpretation and, once again, a need of cross-validation, meaning that if we just have one hit coming from one source in one news outlet, this information may not be relevant. And in addition of collecting this raw information and translating it into a database, we combine it with other sources of information, for instance, the USDA PSD database to have an idea of the production and stock, to put some of this information in context. But similarly, in terms of trade volume, trade values, but for what we are interested in for food and fertilizer, because this time we also include fertilizer, we convert them in the nutrient equivalent. So if it is food, we look mainly at calories. And if it is fertilizer, we look at the contents in nitrogen, potash, and potassium, because that will help us to aggregate over the different measures that can cover different products. And we cannot just add tons. Adding dollar is one possibility, but because dollar varies a lot, and in some cases also can be impacted by quality and things like this, we rely on this nutrient analysis. And at the end, both if you're a farmer or if you are a consumer, the nutrient is maybe what you are more interested in at one point. And we do this work is done on a daily basis. And the tracker is updated on a daily basis as new measures come online, or just a couple of times a week when it's happened. So the tracker, what it looks like. So you have link, you will see on the IFPRI website and on the food security portal some text explaining what the tracker is about. But at the end, the core of the system is a big Tableau visualization tool that you can access, and that has different tabs covering different topics, and that will present both aggregated and disaggregated information. So when you land, you see this screen with a map showing basically which countries are implementing measures right now. And the more extreme these measures are in terms of restricting their own export, the darker you see on the picture, and you have also a dot. So I'm not going to go very in detail, but here you see basically you have, currently kind of 3 hotspots. One is around the MENA region, and there are countries that are reacting to what's happened in the Black Sea. Then you have big exporters like Russia and Argentina that actually used to implement such practices. And you have Indonesia with the palm oil sector that is not driven by the Black Sea crisis, but the other vegetable oil sectors, both in what's happened on palm oil and on sunflower oil, is impacted. And of course, in terms of calorie, that's going to matter a lot. In the database, we just have 3 broad categories of export restriction measure: export tax, export ban, and licensing. Now, The border between the two, how they are combined, is not as clear as we can think. Some measure can be combined, so we don't want to double count or to overlap. And, between a licensing system that is used in a very restrictive way and a ban, actually, there is not so much differences for people on the ground. So I will just say, be careful about how you interpret some of this data. And I think Majda has already said, sometimes you are just enlarging a quota. So the question is it a new measure in the database or also just a modification of something that already exists? And because this is not a work we do on a continuous basis, if there was a measure in July last year, we didn't have it, and now it's going to appear if it is modified now. So just that. On the lower right corner of this type of interface, you will see two useful buttons. One is about using this visualization in full screen on your computer, on your tablet, and just refresh it if you have a problem of resolution. But you have also a button that allows to export all of this screen in a picture, but also one that basically allows you to get the whole collection in one PowerPoint. So all the slides I'm going to show you, basically, you just click on it and you download everything and you have a PowerPoint with 12 slides if you want to have something like that. So it's very actually easy to use. So we have slides that we actually list the measure and we classify them and we indicate for each measure the magnitude, when it starts, when it ends. If you do a mouse over your tooltip, you will see also information on the source of that. And last but not least, we try to validate with some of the notification process that my two colleagues has referred to about what exists in the WTO. Now, something that is also striking is obviously all countries are not notifying what they do, but some countries that can seem smaller in terms of size or in terms of delegation can do a better job than larger economies. So really, I think that here it's a political will more than for many actors, a lack of capacity, because when country wants, country do. Then we also combine the evolution of this crisis with previous ones. So here on this slide, you see an evolution over time. In the lower part, for individual measure, we have this type of Gantt chart. But on the upper part, you see the red line that is the current situation. And you can compare to the orange one, what is in 2007, 2008. And on the blue line, what's happened during the COVID. So during the COVID episode, you see that we have a spike. And then after people, at least on the food sectors, have tried to be more cooperative or have seen that there is less need of having this measure, when right now we are basically catching up in terms of speed with what we have seen in the previous crisis. You can also generate some country profile from the exporter point of view, so where you will see on one end the measure applied with different metrics, and on the right-hand side, for example, the stocks coming from the USDA PSD database, so to have an idea of if there is actually a kind of shortage or not, because sometimes you can see a difference between the statement and the country, what seems to be the situation. And here also we provide information compared to previous years to have an idea of how things look like in this specific situation. Then you can have screens that look at it from more the importer point of view. So you see now how much, for example, calories are restricted in terms of your own imports by these measures. And you can rank countries too. Similar discussion on the fertilizer. And for the fertilizer, we do the split between nitrogenous, potash, and phosphate. And here also you can broaden the map. You have tooltip indicators, or you can also sort the graphs by smaller or bigger. So you can really use this relatively interactively. Last but not least, you may just want to see the raw information. So we have also a link where you can, on a daily basis, get the extract of the underlying data set, where basically all the measures will be listed row by row, and you can have them in a CSV format, and you will see the source we use. Even when we have many sources, we just put two, but we always try to get the couple of sources. If there's a WTO notification, we have identified, you will also see the reference of the document, and so on. So just a few conclusions. On one hand, we use this information for additional analytical purposes. Internally at IFPRI, both in terms of other tools, like we have a specific dashboard on fertilizer information that is fed by these systems, and we also do some vulnerability analysis for countries in terms of food security. But the tracker in itself is mainly about descriptive information. Now we just do various indicators about how we describe this measure, but we don't draw specific conclusion. As I've said, we just have to be careful about, how some of these measures can be listed from a legal point of view, or from the government point of view, versus how they are actually, practically becoming more restrictive or less restrictive, or basically being prohibitive to trade. Something we have much more difficulty to track is when these measures are phased out, in particular if they are done discreetly, or if initially when they were announced there was uncertainty about the end date. Because it means also that some of the phasing out is not really recorded in news outlets, so sometimes we are just going to assume an end date, for example, at the end of the calendar year, when it may occur before in a few cases. Two last points. On one hand, we work a lot on this automation, both in terms of collecting information through different languages, and look also at different system to browse the information. We have also a form online that allows people to crowdsource information by reporting their own measure. But we also do, or basically each piece of information right now, we assess a degree of relevance, and our goal is basically to use more artificial intelligence in the future and machine learning to do some of the intensive work that a human is doing every day. But for this, we still need to build basically a data set to be able to train the artificial intelligence on it. Last but not least, we start to have a satellite kind of data set that is not online right now, that is to record information on quota, especially because if you want to do more analysis or simulation, knowing that you have a quota is not enough. Okay, you need to know the size of the quota and the size of the quota. I think also Majda has referred to that. So that was not an information we are collecting initially, but information we are trying to now collect more systematically. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, David. Chad, I'm going to turn to you to finish off the presentations. Just remind the audience, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll try to get those answers to some of those once Chad is done. Thanks.
Okay, I'm sharing my screen here. I just want to make sure everybody can see it okay.
Yeah, looks good.
Great. So my name is Chad Bown. I'm a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics here in Washington. I've been at a lot of places. I'm a trade economist. I'm going to talk about the financial and other kinds of sanctions today, but think of me as a trade economist. And I like to think of myself as the early pioneers of tracking. Joe mentioned the Phase 1 US-China agreement. But long before that, if any of you had heard of me, it was probably through this database I had done with the World Bank, the Global Anti-Dumping Database, that predates even the Global Trade Alert in the financial crisis of 2007-8. So I'm so impressed by all of the work that all of your agencies and organizations have put together to track things so much better on the trade policy side than we were used to able to do. So congratulations. That being said, I'm going to warn you, because what I'm going to present today is both orders of magnitude dumber, but also in a sense harder, and for reasons I'll try to explain. So congratulations, and I apologize for what we're only going to be able to do at the beginning stages of tracking the financial sanctions world now in response to the war. So I'm going to walk through what we're basically doing so far, try to talk us through a couple of examples that I've been thinking through about how some of these sanctions might impact food supplies, and then maybe some ideas for how to build this into database, never quite to get to where you all are at on the trade side, but maybe in ways that are kind of more useful. So we have built out so far a website, and the link is provided in the slides, and I'll send it to you if anybody's interested. And basically for now, it's just a relatively pretty way of describing in short form all of the sanctions that have happened so far, organizing by countries that have imposed the sanctions, as well as their types. Now, their types are not by industry or product or input or something like we would normally think about them. So far, they're sort of by measure, whether they're financial sanction, sanctioning an oligarch, import restriction, export restriction, things like that. So we've got the broad timeline, sort of the deterrence phase, pre-war, then the escalation 4-day phase of sort of late February, and then the hundreds we're up to now, essentially sanctions since. Now, we do have a bunch of countries, why this is relevant, that aren't sanctioning and have explicitly said that they're not sanctioning, including some that have said, one of the reasons why we're not going to sanction is we're particularly reliant on Russia for fertilizer. This is Brazil's president that has essentially said this. So this is clearly caught up in this whole endeavor. Okay, so let me walk through a couple of examples of why I think this matters and why we need to track it for the issues that you're very much focused on. So let me talk us through how some of these financial sanctions work. And again, I'm not a sanctions expert by training. I'm not a lawyer, and you really do need to have all of the above to really understand where these things bite and where carve-outs are going to try to occur. But let's look at one, which is the kind of the first sanctions that the United States imposed on February 24th. So there were financial sanctions on some Russian banks, but then 13 major Russian state-owned enterprises and private entities. And so the question is, are they being applied to food, or is food, and food is kind of broadly carved out here, could be, actual food, could be seed, could be fertilizer, basically anything in the food supply chain. And the answer is no. The sanctions writers appear to be trying to carve out food, but of course, yes, right? There's going to be a tremendous amount of uncertainty that's brought into this process, and you're going to have folks saying, I don't understand it. This is really complicated. I don't want to get anywhere near this, or opinions could change a week from now, or the public is going to have backlash against me for engaging with Russia, Belarus, whomever. So of course, even when they legally carve these things out, there's still going to be implications. Okay, so this is the February 24th announcement, and you can see they issue these things called general licenses, which basically say these sanctions provide 8 general licenses authorizing certain transactions. So the financial limitations do not apply here. And one of the places is for agricultural and medical commodities. And then you go and you read whatever this general license number 6 is, and it says, yeah, if you're doing transactions with respect to agricultural commodities, food for humans, seeds, fertilizer, then in this instance, you're exempted, right? So legally, okay, but of course, the uncertainty and not wanting to get caught up in this stuff still likely to matter. Okay, a second example in that same U.S. sanctioning package were you may not do transactions with 13 major Russian entities, 2 of which were really, really important for shipping. One is Sovcomflot for maritime shipping, and the other is Russian Railways, obviously, for rail shipping. And obviously, these are going to be huge for the potential movement of foods. And as we've already seen, the fact that financial sanctions have already been imposed, this is earlier this week, so Russian Railways is ruled in default, right, as they haven't been able to live up to their sort of bond payments. So yes, these things are going to, through different channels, ultimately impact a number of the private sector actors that are part of the supply chain for food in ways that are unfortunately quite different and more complicated than trade policy. On the European side, their sanctions could also potentially impose Russian shipping in different ways, as well as beyond. So, we know Belt and Road, they have been building out rail, to get stuff to and from Europe to China through Russia. Now there's kind of a question of, can you use these routes, given all the sanctions? Well, you look at sort of what the legal explainer in the FAQs for the EU is, and trains can still run through Russia, but they can't stop there, right? And so there's just, I think, a lot of uncertainty here, and this is going to impact market participants. And then finally, we've got a lot of big Western multinationals, especially engaging in self-sanctions, right? Voluntarily pulling themselves out of market. Even those that are staying so far, we don't know necessarily how long that is necessarily going to last. So obviously the financial and other sanctions beyond export restrictions, import tariffs, and things like that are going to be impacting food supplies coming out of this region, which we know are hugely important for the world as well. Thanks.
Great, Chad. Thanks so much. Well, good. We do have a little time for questions. So if you can put any questions you might have in the chat, that would be great. Let me start with one while we're waiting for others to come in. And that's, I mean, I think in the case of OECD and WTO, obviously you have ongoing efforts on this, and you know, this predates the current crisis. It, you know, has been going on for a long time with the WTO since 1995 in terms of reporting requirements and other things. But you know, I think in the case of IFPRI, for example, and Chad, you too, I'm sure. I mean, the difficulty is how long do you keep it going, right? And when activity starts to die down, and I mean, let's be honest, this is a burden to keep doing, and particularly if you're a 1 or 2 man operation, which I think both in the case of IFPRI and Chad, I presume you too. I guess the question is, how do you, you know, how does this, I mean, is it okay to just do it on a periodic basis, or should this, how do you institutionalize some of these efforts? Or should they be institutionalized?
So I can speak to that briefly, because I was actually in the Secretariat of the WTO in 2007 when we started ramping up the monitoring of the anti-dumping. And interestingly, the external efforts kind of put pressure on some of my friends within the Secretariat to kind of do more. And so I think that you know, there is a role for everybody to play in this. That being said, when I moved to the World Bank, and it was still this one man, and I couldn't institutionalize it, the anti-dumping database at the time within the World Bank, it essentially died for 5 years after I left, and until you know, the current crisis has sort of re-energized it. So I agree. This question of how do you sustain these things institutionally, which are incredibly important, so they're ready when we need them at times like this, is critical.
So in our case, of course, there is a question of resources, because IFPRI operates based on mainly project money these days. And so the discussion we have is basically with donors to make sure that they understand how relevant it is on the medium and long run to monitor it. So right now we get the support of USAID and FCDO from the UK government to continue this in the coming month. And what we just hope is that, you know, some of this can continue. Of course, it also means that at one point, you know, if nothing happens, then you just report that nothing happens, and people want to know how it's relevant to maintain activities. For us, what also is important is not to use more and more, as I've said, artificial intelligence and machine learning to replace part of the job that can really save humans time to do it. But on the long run, for me, some of these tools can be basically granted to a more formal institution looking at that. Now, I think there's also a sensitive issue, because a lot of the information we use is not official information, or just news-based. And some government also can be sensitive about how we describe their policies. And if you are typically WTO, you may not want to say random things just based on news when you work with government. So there is, I think, potentially a space for players that don't really answer to government on the spot, but can do this type of monitoring on this field and trigger discussion. But I think there's a degree of complementarity between some of the institutions that have to do this monitoring work on all year long and as long as they exist, and the activities we do during crises, where we can really trigger discussion and show awareness, maybe with more freedom than anything that should be vetoed by, or at least clear by a number of formal committee.
Great, David. Majda?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. And I think Rob is also raising an interesting question. Is there a way to have synergies across all these efforts? It is true in our presentation, we made clear that we now have a kind of a baseline of practically 10 years of tracking trade and non-trade related measures with regard, but they only cover 4 basic commodities, and they only relate to AMIS participating countries. So, and also in the case of the WTO, in the field of export restrictions, we may have sometimes notifications or even questions and answers relating to quantitative export restrictions. And I think during my presentation, I only referred to quantitative restrictions, but we do not have a notification system for export taxes. IFPRI does export taxes. We don't. Okay, so I was wondering whether it would be perhaps time to dig out or perhaps recall the effort that we made with the World Bank, FAO, OECD, WTO, to design, and also UNCTAD, to design this non-tariff measures classification. And I think there is a database somewhere. Perhaps it's time to come back to it and see whether we could harmonize all our efforts to track these measures, independently of whether they are export restrictions, domestic support measures, or market access instruments. So this is also food for thought for the future.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent idea. And again, we unfortunately we're limited today to an hour-long discussion, but I think that it would be a good idea to at least consider doing a workshop with interested parties to get in and talk more about that, because I think that would be very useful. Okay, so we're about out of time. Anyone have other points they'd like to raise, or in terms of the presenters, concluding comments or anything? Okay, well, great. Look, this was really great. I appreciate it. We can let, I don't know if maybe I'll confirm with you individually, but it would be great if we can make these presentations available to the people, and we can maybe get those on the AMIS website or something like that. Simone, I'll work with you afterwards. But for all you joining, we had a great crowd. I think over 100 people and frankly, this was on the spur of the moment. We really pulled this together in the last few days, and hope to do more of these information webinars in the future. But in the meantime, I really want to thank all of you for helping with this panel, and this was just great and very informative. So with that, thanks everyone, and we'll be back soon.